people who are, okay. We're recording it so people who cannot attend the entire thing or weren't able to attend it at all can view it at a later date off of our website. If you haven't already done so, please mute your microphone and turn off your video. All right. So we encourage you to interact with us. You can ask questions at any time. If you're on a computer, you'll see there's a bar when you hover around that has a chat function. If you're on a phone, a mobile phone, it'll look like this. And when you hit that chat box, this will pop up and you can type your question there. Okay. Let some more people in here. All right. And another way to interact with us is give us some feedback or answer basic questions that will be asked during the presentation. So if you click on the participant section of the bar,
Lucy, it's Paula here. We can't hear you at all. I don't know if you have a headset. Sorry to interrupt you, but no one can hear.
Okay, is this better like this? Hello, hello? Is this better like this?
Folks, can you hear Lucy better that way?
No, but we can hear you, Robert.
Huh, odd. Okay.
So Robert, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, well my part is almost done. I'm encouraging people to interact with us when we have questions and they can answer by clicking on the participant section, and this menu will pop up. So at the test, we'll ask you, can you see the presentation and hear it clearly? So if we could get some feedback, please.
Yeah, so folks, just click the on your participant view there, click the yes, no, or so we're going to use some of this interactivity throughout the webinar. So being sort of fluent in the use of this sort of menu will be helpful. And if you are having a lot of audio problems, in other words, you can't hear any of us, the other option is for you to dial in via the phone, specifically to tackle the audio.
All right, so we'll introduce Robert Waterhouse. He's a senior advisor in the Industry Development and Support Department of Energy Safety Canada. In this role, Robert works with industry and our association partners to assess, design, facilitate, and promote safety initiatives for the upstream oil and gas industry in Canada. Mr. Waterhouse is a certified industrial hygienist and has over 20 years of health and safety experience in consulting, corporate, and safety associated work environment. Thank you, Robert.
Cool. All right, I'll just give me a second here. Uh, 2 seconds. Get my screen up. Just to test if everyone can let me know, or yes responses if you can see my screen. Got a few thumbs up. And Okay. All right. So, fatality and serious injury prevention. So this is some of the things we're going to talk about. This is a really important topic, I think, certainly in general, and for a variety of reasons right now. I mean, there's some consultation that the Alberta government's doing on this specific piece, so we'll talk about that. We also talk about the program that we put together, working in conjunction with the Alberta government and the data collection and so on and so forth. So we'll get into that, and then we're going to go into some of the details in relation to our guideline that we have as well. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of an air travel story here. I want you to imagine that you're sitting in this plane here, and you're maybe the person either on the right there with the orange shirt, or the person just in front of that person. And up in front of you, about maybe 3 or 4 rows, is a person that seems to be struggling a little bit. Every few minutes, one of the flight attendants walks by and has to remind this individual that they need to put their feet in behind the seat in front of them. And it's about maybe 3 or 4 instances where the flight attendant is actually telling the individual that they need to put their feet behind the seat, and it's like rules and regulations to keep the aisle clear and so on and so forth. And so I mean, I think it just in general, I mean, when we talk about safety, right, I mean, we all have our own perspective on different things, but we all value safety. And it's just a sort of an interest perspective, using the yes and no feature in the participant panel. Just tell me what your perspective is on this individual relative to whether or not you think they value safety or not, yes or no. So we're seeing a few yeses and quite a few no's there. 10 no's versus 6 yeses. So we'll just proceed from there. So when you think about that, would it change your perspective? I mean, some of you on the webinar probably know me, and then others maybe know of me, or many of you probably don't know who I am at all. What if I told you this was me, that was that individual that constantly had his feet out in the aisle, and was constantly reminded by the flight attendant to move his feet back in the seat in front of him? Would that change your perspective, right? And the reality is, this actually happened to me. I was on a flight. I got on the plane, sat down. One of the last people to get on the plane actually came up and stood there. So I was like, okay, I got to get up. I was on the aisle seat, and proceeded to get into the middle seat and sit down on the plane. And they had behind them 2 full-size golden retriever dogs. And they basically, sat down, and the dogs, basically one dog was sort of situated, beneath the feet of the, they were seeing eye dogs. One dog was beneath the feet of the gal that came in with them. And then the other one basically was under my feet. And, I basically said to the flight attendant, well, hang on a second here, how's this going to work? And, they pretty much informed me that the flight was full. There were no other seats. And if I had, an issue with it, I could basically, rebook and get on another flight. And so pretty much through the whole flight, I had an immense amount of difficulty. It was a 4.5-hour flight. I believe I was flying from Houston to Calgary at the time. And you can imagine how fun that was. My feet were basically stuffed in the back of the seat in front of me on the little silver sort of struts to hold the chair in place. And I mean, obviously, I wasn't set up for success in my journey. And certainly when I got up and went to the bathroom, which I did lots of because my legs were cramping up, I could look at the people that were in the seats behind me, and you should have seen the dirty looks that I got from folks, because they basically looked at it and said, what's up with this idiot? But the reality is if you'd walked down the aisle and you'd actually looked what I was dealing with, you would have had a completely different perspective. And I tell this story in relation to PSI just to get you thinking about context. And I mean, there's lots of incidents, you know, like if I said, oh, I cut my hand and, you know, and I was, you know, I brushed up against something in some, you know, industrial setting, a piece of equipment, and, you know, caused some abrasion or, you know, on the side of my hand. You might say, well, you know, maybe you should be more careful. You might want to wear gloves, you know, blah, 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 right? But if I told you I cut my hand, and lucky it's just a little cut, but you know, what were you doing? Well, I stuck my hand under the lawnmower while it was running to pull the garden hose out. Your perspective would change instantly. You would look at that and say, wow, that's a situation where you could have lost your hand, let alone getting a cut. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here today, is those types of situations and the value that they bring to industry, because in many cases nothing happens, but the learning potential and the opportunity for something to happen or to happen again is obviously what we want to be focusing on. So right now, Alberta OH&S has a consultation that's going on the OH&S Act, and one of those items is PSI. And so, you know, we started on this initiative. I guess it would have been, well, the Bill 30 came out, I believe it was in like October, November, somewhere around there of 2017. And in the early part of 2018, we started working on this PSI topic and basically wanted to put together some resources for industry. At the time, we were driving towards a guideline, basically to establish what a PSI was. And so we eventually got involved with, you know, a variety of other associations in the industry, as well as the Alberta government, in consultation with them. And so the process that exists right now is a function of that. But right now, Alberta is looking for some feedback on things like, you know, how should worksite parties be accountable for PSIs? Is there value in mandating and reporting a PSI? How should a PSI be defined, and is there a reporting requirement? Were to be maintained, how should the government use PSIs? And we're going to get into more detail on PSIs. I just want to throw that out there so you're thinking about that when we go through this presentation. And I'm going to remind you about it at the end as well, because certainly, you know, if you're providing feedback to the government, you know, use this as an opportunity to, you know, have some conversations and creative thinking around these questions. So, you know, from a data perspective, one of the things that we've been doing is basically, you know, getting access to the PSI data that the Alberta government has, that, you know, for the industry, for oil and gas, and actually we just got that data yesterday at about lunchtime. So I was originally planning to have some slides in here on that, but we just haven't. Unfortunately, the process of getting that data has been pretty lengthy, so. I will speak a little bit about some generalities, but I'm just going to show you here some of the slides in relation to life-saving rules or fatality data. And when you talk about PSIs, you're really talking about serious injuries and fatalities and wanting to do something to prevent those. You can see on this slide, we've had some pretty good progress as an industry. You know, we continue to have good progress. However, you know, it's not certainly, you know, incremental in the sense that, you know, large parts of our industry have sort of flatlined relative to fatality reduction. And part of that means, you know, that we need to do some things differently than what we've done in the past if we want to move the bar relative to safety in the fatality and serious injury sort of, you know, sort of perspective. And so when we look at our fatality data, this is how that data groups out. Basically, you know, transportation accidents are our number one, you know, highway accidents are number one sort of cause or category of fatality, exposure to harmful substances being second, and then contact with objects and equipment being third. And for a lot of people, this totally makes sense. If you're familiar with other, you know, maybe provincial averages, certainly occupational exposure usually is at the top for oil and gas, just because of the amount of transportation-related work we do that trumps the workplace exposures. So it's just important to be aware about that, because we all do driving all the time. We do a lot of it in this industry. and sometimes we can take that for granted, right? Here's sort of the rates of the different sort of top 5, sort of categories of fatalities within our industry. You can see everything sort of plummeted down here over the last little bit. Certainly with industry downturn and other challenges that we've been facing, that's in part, and certainly I would hope that with some of the initiatives like on life-saving rules and other things that we're doing, that maybe we're influencing some of these numbers as well, because fatalities aren't numerous, which is a good thing. It'll take a while for us to be able to with statistical confidence be able to say, hey, we've made a difference in this space, but that's certainly something we'll be looking at going forward.
Robert, it's Lucy.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a moment? Can you switch out of presenter mode?
Yeah. Are you seeing everything on my screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about that.
Perfect.
I can. Did that fix it?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. So transportation accidents, like we talked about, highway accident number 1, pedestrian non-passenger struck by vehicle. So those are sort of your line of fire type incidents, and then it goes down from there, right? Exposure to harmful substances. Obviously, we talked about occupational disease, workplace exposures. Lots of this blue here, which represents the over 75% of the exposure fatalities, is basically asbestos. So it's an occupational disease. And then you have your exposure to caustic noxious substances, which actually it tends to be dominated by some carbon monoxide, H2S, things like that. Certainly H2S makes up a big component of that. And then contact with electric current is actually included in this category. That's just the CSA classification structures, and we follow that. And so that might not be terribly intuitive, but that's the way they kind of group things. And then looking at contact with objects, we basically have struck by object, which is the vast majority, and then caught in, and then caught or contact with object is sort of unspecified. Now this blue bar here of struck by object, this basically is dominated. When you break this out and one step lower, you actually see falling objects or dropped objects as being your dominant category. I think it's actually around 60% of this blue bar is dropped objects, and that's a really good fit from a perspective with PSI. I mean, having seen some of the preliminary data that the government, like I said, just shared with us yesterday, and some of the ongoing work that we're going to be doing in this space. When we look at that work, we certainly see dropped objects is coming to the top of that list on PSIs. The companies have submitted. So in other words, so keep that in mind. We do have some initiatives on dropped objects right now, which I won't really get into, but we are trying to be as proactive as an organization as we can to work on things that that we believe are an issue, and certainly when the data is lining up both within fatalities as well as within PSIs to that effect, that's good. It means we're all on the right path of what we need to be doing, as far as prevention strategies and whatnot. And then the last being certainly fires and explosions and falls. And I guess one of the questions I would say to folks is, what's common amongst all these things that we just talked about on these fatalities? And the answer is, in many cases, I mean, when you look at fall on same level versus fall to lower level, certainly if you're falling off a building from a height, for example, there's a lot of energy associated with that. Similarly, in fires and explosions, you have a lot of hazardous energy present, and certainly contact objects, vehicles, you're dealing with a lot of hazardous energy, and so that's the common thing that runs through typically fatalities, and it tends to be the differentiator between what causes fatalities and what causes maybe a cut finger, for example, and so that's just one thing that I think folks need to differentiate in their mind. And you guys have heard this probably from other people as well in the industry. The things that kill you are not necessarily the same things that, cause you to have a first aid or a medical aid, for example. And when we talk about hazardous energy, certainly within, one of the things you'll see lots of companies use is an energy wheel, and it's really about getting people out there and looking for this stuff. and trying to open the eyes of a different perspective. We can be very focused on, regulatory compliance and programs, which are obviously very important. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's regulations written for everything out there, and this is why you do hazard assessments and stuff. And it's important to think about different types of hazardous energy and recognize that some things may be more inherently hazardous just in themselves, like say if you had asbestos or something like that. A lot of times when we talk about chemical hazardous energy, people tend to think about, for example, the energy of a reaction of chemicals that releases pressure or heat, for example. But you can also look at the chemical itself as being hazardous energy and having potential. And you can think about that from a biological perspective as well. We may have some conversations and questions from people around COVID as it relates to this topic as well. So keeping it real, I mean, there's been over 300 fatalities in the last 17 years within the oil and gas funding codes. This is basically like, on average about 20 fatalities per year on average. That's a lot of people, and obviously we want to, we don't want anyone to get hurt, and this sort of fits in with, the zero kind of mantra around, the reality is, we need to be in a mindset where we're doing absolutely everything possible to basically prevent all injuries, but certainly fatalities and serious injuries start there. And we could have long conversations about zero and pros and cons of all that, but the reality is, if your mindset is that, well, we kill people every couple of years and that's just the way it is, that's completely unacceptable. We need to basically do as much as possible, and in some cases think differently about how we're going to actually prevent fatalities than what we do with our normal incidents. And so that's kind of just what I was talking about here, which I think I've kind of said enough on that. Like that could be a whole presentation in itself. So this is my example, and I just kind of refer to this, and from our early part of our discussion, right? I mean, here I am going around the corner, and I'll set the backdrop for this. I wanted to cut the grass. I was in a bit of a hurry. There was a zillion mosquitoes in the backyard. I couldn't find the bug spray. So I was motoring along and I went around this corner, and the little edge here on my, this is like that, it's not wood, it's like a plastic composite board material, expensive stuff. It didn't quite fit quite right, and so there was a little bit of a sharp edge there, and I came around the corner and I basically cut my a bit of my arm on it there, right? And so the question would be, is this a PSI? Does this have the potential to cause a serious injury? And the reality is, no, it doesn't. If you look at the hazardous energy associated with this, there's no way I can seriously injure myself relative to this edge here. There's plenty of hazardous energy down here in this lawnmower. And if the incident was, I hit something and I, flipped the lawnmower over and landed on it, that's a completely different story. But the hazardous energy associated with what occurred here was with me hitting my arm on this sharp edge. And certainly you can say, well, why is that sharp edge like that? And I've tried to get caps for it, and I haven't found anything that's ideal yet, other than replacing all the boards, this is a custom order. I think it was like $300 or something just for one piece. Gloves might not be a bad idea. Probably the better strategy is just to be a bit more mindful and not rush, because that's ultimately what I was doing. And, mind on task kind of stuff, right? Which is more difficult to manage on an ongoing basis, because people are people and we do all kinds of interesting things, sometimes that aren't in our best interests at times. So what is a potentially serious incident? It's similar to high potential incidents. You've probably heard of that. Serious injury and fatality potential, SIF or SIF potential. Dangerous occurrence is a term that's used in some provinces. And one of the things to think about is a company with a PSI a risky company? And you may say, well, that seems like a funny thing to ask. What do you mean? And so, for example, if you're a company and you say, hey, I'm a client, I want to know if companies are having PSIs, and you ask companies to, create a metric around that, because this is such a newer topic in many places in our industry, and there can be lots of misunderstandings and stuff. You don't want to do anything that's going to compromise the sharing of that information relative to something that could have been a fatality, because you want you know, complete transparency around that so you can prevent that from becoming a fatality, not, you know, and many of us in the industry would say, yeah, I've been out on site, we've seen things that have happened 3 times, and the 4th time it resulted in a serious injury, and everyone was like, well, yeah, we all should have done something about that, but there was all these problems getting in the way, right? And so it's an important thing to think about. If you have a company that's very focused on this and they're reporting lots of this even internally in their own company, let alone, you know, the government aspect of things, because they may have their own definitions that might be, you know, at a lower risk tolerance, if you will. You know, and you ask them, how many do you have? And you go, wow, that seems like a high number. Maybe we shouldn't hire you. Well, I mean, the company that doesn't have any, you know, might have lots, but they're just not reporting it. And so when you're dealing with things that are new, that's something to be very aware of. So what are the regulatory requirements around this? Just a quick review. Saskatchewan basically has what they call dangerous occurrence, an occurrence that does not result in but could have resulted in the death of a worker or hospital admission. They have a bunch of unique requirements in their legislation. They reference, you know, SCBA failures and, you know, bursting grinding wheels and things like this. So they do have some specific items. Manitoba, same type of legislation. It's almost exact. There's just a couple nuances relative to some of the examples. East Coast Canada and the offshore oil and gas development, they refer to a person and not a worker. So that's an interesting sort of shift, right? And part of that has to do with, if you remember years ago, there was that incident in Calgary where a piece of sheet metal came off a building and killed a little girl across the street. Sorry, I can't remember her name right now. But you know, when you talk about people versus workers, right? We have to realize that sometimes our hazards on our workplaces don't stay on our workplaces. They actually go elsewhere and affect other people. And certainly when you think of fugitive emissions and maybe an H2S release, that'd be a good example from an oil and gas perspective. So they refer to a person, not a worker, and reporting an event that had the potential for a fatality or a major injury. British Columbia requires incidents that had the potential for causing serious injury to a worker to be investigated. And they have a detailed reporting requirements that list a variety of different things. It's very specific and it's quite long. Alberta focuses on people rather than workers, so that's similar to what the offshore industry's been doing. They focus on hospital admission, and they have the usual suspects like crane collapses, building collapses, fires, things like that. But they also have this potential serious incident piece, which is more of a performance-based system rather than prescriptive. And so within our guideline, we have this decision tree that we worked really hard with industry and with the Alberta government on basically being able to you know, decide whether something is a PSI or not. And so basically, if you look at the top here, we have an incident or event has occurred. It excludes actual serious injuries and fatalities. Obviously, those already have their reporting requirements. And the first question you want to ask yourself is, was the incident similar to incidents in recent years that caused serious injury or a fatality? So if you say, well, yeah, actually 2 years ago we had someone die of this and it was exactly the same, then there's no point really spending too much time, you know, analyzing it. You probably already have your answer to go, yes, actually that is a PSI. And then was hazardous energy present and sufficient to cause a serious injury? And this is really important piece, particularly tied to, you know, the potential to cause a fatality. There are lots of things that can hurt you, but, you know, in many instances, they're not the same things that can actually kill you. And the potential for you to actually be seriously injured or die is not there in some instances. So could slightly different circumstances have resulted in a serious injury? So this is things like timing, distance, body position, etc. And so the reality is that if you're sitting there and you're going like, wow, that was lucky, man. Robert, you reached under there to grab the hose and, you know, you just got a nick on your finger and the lawnmower didn't take your hand off. What are the odds? Well, if that's the kind of situation that's going on, then that's a PSI. And, you know, if you're like, well, if I moved over here 2 feet, it wouldn't have hit me and I would have been fine. Or that's what happened. If I moved 2 feet over here, it would have hit me. You know, those are situations where you're like, this is a PSI. And the last test that basically people want to do is basically looking at controls and were the controls successful in protecting people from exposure to that hazardous energy. So for example, if you have a well-established and adhered to exclusion zone on your site, no one goes in there, and you have a, for example, you're doing an overhead lift and, a cable breaks and results in a bunch of pipe falling down on the ground, that wouldn't be a PSI because you had an established control and it was very effective. However, if the quality of that control was very weak and you had people wandering around there and no one was just happened to be there in that moment, you'd say, well, that is a PSI. And so there's a gray area in here, certainly, but you have to ask yourself some questions. And the reality is the gut response that you have when you hear about the incident and when you get the context, thinking about what I talked about at the beginning, that's the part that probably will give you the best indication. If your gut response is, holy cow, that guy is lucky to be alive, you're pretty much dealing with a PSI. So this decision tree is in the the guideline. And so here's a nice example from a safety alert. If you go through Energy Safety Canada safety alerts, there's lots of PSIs, and we're calling them out now actually in the safety alerts. But going in the past and looking through them, you can see lots of PSI topics in there. Hence why people gave them to us, because they went, there's a lot of value in the learnings of this. So here we have workers were involved in conducting a hydrochloric acid tubing pickle on a sweet well. 4 workers were on top of the tank to watch the returns as the degasser line was open. Gas monitors alarmed and workers began to evacuate. 3 of the 5 workers were rendered unconscious after reaching ground level. And the source of this was from sulfur basically that was in the inside of this pipe, and it was pipe that had been used previously in a sour well and was now being used on a sweet well, and they basically pulled the H2S, if you will, right out of the steel and off the steel, and this is a PSI for sure. I mean, no one's hurt. 24 hours after, everyone's fine. It's like nothing happened, and yet you sit there and you go, whoa, that gives me the shivers, because you were so close to having potentially multiple people not around with us anymore, right? So it's a good example. So thinking about hazardous energy, chemical exposures for workers obviously is something that's that we've put in the guideline and we're focused on, and we tied that basically to immediately dangerous to life and health H2S levels. So for example, H2S has an ideal H of 100 parts per million, and so this is a good criteria. If you're have a worker who's unprotected and is exposed to an ideal H level of a compound for which there's criteria within NIOSH, then pretty odds are you're dealing with a PSI. There's also similar criteria for people rather than workers. And there's a variety of different resources you can use. We list a few different ones there that give you times and concentrations for different substances for non-workers, members of the public. Just going to close my window here. Neighbors making some noise. So hazardous energy, thinking about flammability, similarly here, you can have a range of different opinions on this. Certainly the regulatory requirement around LEL is 20%. Lots of us would probably say, well, that's, the minimum, right? So 10% is probably not a bad place. Maybe even any LEL is something that you would want to look at. Anyway, it's something to be thinking about if you have workers that are basically working in these type of environments. Keep in mind, I mean, you might say, well, they got PPE. Well, SCBA does not protect you from being in a flash fire or blowing up. It protects you from workplace exposures. So you sit there and go, well, that control isn't effective, so you essentially have a problem, right? Oxygen deficiency, you're dealing with nitrogen, for example, or just displacing a lot of air through maybe, tank gauging and things like this. Keep in mind, it only takes a couple breaths in a low oxygen environment to drop you, and it can be, workers themselves can be very sort of not aware of just how significant this be and what the implications can be. So I would encourage you to think about where low oxygen environments could be in your operations. It's more than likely going to be associated when you're doing something, possibly confined space injury as well. Hazardous energy around dropped objects, perfect fit, right? I mean, we're all familiar with dropped objects. We're doing some work on dropped objects right now with a bunch of different resources will be coming out here in September. And you know, dropped objects and the tool is a good one to use that Drops Online has, where you look at a tool and you put the mass in and the height that it's dropping at, and it'll tell you if it hit you, what kind of injury you would get. And so you can say, hey, you know, this object fell out of, you know, off a building or off a derrick, and it landed right next to this worker but didn't hit him. And then you can do the calculation and go, yeah, if it actually did hit him, there's a good chance he would have been dead. You know, you're dealing with a PSI right there, right? There's no question. You're going, holy cow, man, did we get lucky? And then similarly, when you get into situations thinking about vehicles, you have some of the same questions. So here's a question for you: which has more kinetic energy, a .30 caliber bullet from a muzzle of a rifle, or a typical car traveling at 20 kilometers an hour? And the answer is actually the vehicle. It's quite a bit more, about 7 times more, and there's some variation in here when you look at grains in the bullet and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, there is a lot more energy in a vehicle than we really think about it. And if you want to visualize what this looks like, you know, you think about when you're going to Costco or the mall or wherever you're going on the weekend or in the evening, and you're standing in a parking lot and there's cars moving around that might be only a couple feet away from you. Imagine what would it be if you took a piece of rebar and you welded it onto the frame of that vehicle and had it sticking out of the front of it, and think about what that would look like if that ran into you, right? That's not a pretty sight, because it's essentially going to be very similar to the outcome of a bullet, because of the large mass that's involved there. I mean, it would basically go right through you like a hot knife, like in butter, right? So we are, because of vehicles and, you know, they're around and they're a necessity in our life, but we are rather complacent to just the inherent amount of energy and hazard that is there. And I would encourage you all to think about that the next time you're in a parking lot or on a road somewhere walking, keeping in mind that, you know, lots of our transportation related fatalities, the second cause anyway, is people being struck by vehicles. So it is happening in our industry. It is unfortunately taking people's lives. And you know, when you look at the amount of speed, 20 kilometers an hour basically will result in about 10% of the individuals being hit with that speed, resulting in a fatality. There's some great research that's been done here. You know, in the past, breaking that down, looking at all the accidents and speeds and you know, the different scenarios, and you know, 20 kilometers an hour is typically where you see speed limits in parking lots and you know spaces like that. So for that very reason. And then, you know, just one last thing here on hazardous energy is process safety. That's dealing with, you know, typically the release or the loss of containment of hazardous energy and materials in process equipment. So in other words, keep it in the pipe, keep it in the tank, keep it in the vessel, kind of stuff. And if you have that type of material, like oil and gas, you know, that we have in our industry, and it gets out, generally bad things happen. Irrespective of whether or not there's someone injured or not, those have the potential for serious consequences to the site, you know, burning down the whole site, for example, or major fatalities, etc. And so when you're dealing with process safety incidents, you need to be thinking about PSI potential there as well, because there's a fair bit of overlap between those two. And just moving back to life-saving rules for a sec here, you know, we've done a lot of work on this, and certainly lots of companies have adopted this and moving in that direction. So that's great to see. These are the rules that we have at Energy Safety Canada, and the reality is that if you're dealing with a non-compliance to a life-saving rule, you may also be dealing with a PSI, but those two are not necessarily perfectly linked. So many of these life-saving rules have to do with hazardous energy, but not all of them, right? Fit for duty, for example, you know, line of fire is energy isolation, obviously, working at height, confined space, driving, you know, hot work, safe mechanical lifting, but, you know, work authorization is not directly related, but, you know, maybe a factor as well. And so it's just something to think about, because there are certainly situations where a PSI is also a non-compliance with the life-saving rule, but then there's situations where it isn't. And so I'll give you an example. If you're in a parking lot, you back up your car and you don't put your seatbelt on, you say, well, that's a non-compliance with the life-saving rule of driving because you're wearing your seatbelt, the vehicle's in motion. However, there's no potential in that specific instance for you to die or be seriously injured. If you were driving like that out on the road, you know, as you go down the highway, then you could maybe have that conversation, but nothing has actually happened. And we typically focus on there being some type of an event or release of hazardous energy and exposure to that for it to be a PSI. And similarly, you may have a situation where, you know, there's a major release of crude, say through a pipeline that maybe it's got some malfunction or there's a corrosion issue or something like that, and the worker has, you know, the workers just happen to be standing there. It has nothing to do with what they did or didn't do. It might have to do with what other people did or didn't do, but not, you know, that specific worker. So learning from tragedy, each of the 300 plus individuals that lost their lives, you know, have their story in our data, and that's the case for obviously for everyone. And 3 stories of tragedy have been graciously shared with us. So I'm just going to show those here, you know, through the Threads of Life program. So this is Jordan. Jordan was 18 and had less than 2 months on the job at a perforating shape charge manufacturing plant in Standard, Alberta. Jordan was a vintage muscle car enthusiast and had plans to become an auto mechanic when he finished high school. Basically, they were pulling, trying to get a forklift unstuck, and the ball hitch off of the vehicle basically came off and went through the back window, the window of the forklift, and hit Jordan and fatally injured him. Line of fire. You know, if that had basically gone through the window and not hit Jordan, or even if it had fallen off and landed somewhere else, you'd be like, well, that's a PSI. There's no question about that. And in this instance, unfortunately, it resulted in a fatality. You know, Dustin, similar situation. Dustin loved the oil field and started working at rigs at the age of 16. He was very loyal to his family, friends, and employers. Dustin had a passion for public speaking and storytelling. Dustin was a seasoned laborer on a pipeline project. As he had been taught to do, he stepped in between the side boom and the pipe to attach the rolly pipe cradle. The boom suddenly fell, pinning Dustin between the boom and the pipe. Despite the actions of people on site, basically he succumbed to his injuries. The boom line had slipped through cable clamps that were the wrong size and had been hand tightened the night before, and no one did an inspection on that. So I mean, if that had slipped away and it never it hit him, he ducked out of the way at the last minute, you'd be like, well, there's a PSI. Nothing happened. I mean, there was an event, but there was no injury, but it certainly had the potential. And you can have an injury with PSIs and it be minor and be looking at the potential for it to be serious too, right? And then Blaine here, with respect to driving. So Blaine was 23 years old and spent a lot of spare time helping his dad, Bruce. He bought a new calf table in the spring of 2012, and he helped Bruce place it in the branding pen. Blaine planned to be the 4th generation on our farm, or as Blaine liked to call it, the ranch. And Blaine was moving a service rig along a treacherous highway with minimal shoulder and very steep ditches. Somehow on this busy road where truckers and school buses compete for space, Blaine's truck veered off towards the ditch. He tried to correct and come out, but unfortunately rolled and was crushed and died. And no one knows for sure what happened there. Certainly you could look at, you know, fit for duty as being an aspect. Hypothetically, people sort of say, like, his family basically says, well, he liked to keep a lot of candy and he had jars of candy, and maybe, you know, that's, you know, maybe that spilt over and he reached down to grab the jubes, I think it was, and went off the side of the road, right? So, you know, if he'd gone off the road and, you know, rolled his vehicle or whatever and was fine and walked away from it, you'd be like PSI. Or even if he was, you know, with minor injuries, you'd say, well, that's a PSI. I mean, you could have died. You could have been seriously injured. So one of the things we, you know, just talking about fit for duty with Blaine there, you know, we've done a fair bit of work on it here more recently. So certainly encourage you guys to have a look at that. The reality is people are fallible. We make mistakes. We make errors. And so when we're dealing with Fit for Duty, we're trying to build people's capacity to basically, be better at, and companies to be better at managing Fit for Duty in various aspects. And that's not just drug and alcohol and fatigue. It's a whole range of different things. So it's about helping people, creating capacity, and setting workers and companies up for success in the safe execution of work, right? People will fail. So what is your plan? And Todd Conklin, if you're familiar with him, talks a lot about rumble strips. Where are the rumble strips in your process? Rumble strips, you're familiar with those on the road. They give you a sort of a warning that you're drifting off the highway. So where are those weak signals in your operations that at an individual and at a systems level can provide feedback? And so just remember that context is what matters and how work gets done versus how work is imagined. And the reality is people are going to make mistakes. And so, we don't want PSIs, fatalities. We want to build capacity in our system so that, if a person does make a mistake, they don't have a serious injury or die. And so that's certainly one of why I connect in the Fit for Duty piece here. So a couple last things I just want to talk about, which is the program. It's on our website right now. It will be sort of launched tomorrow. And we have this PSI program where you're basically, the website is on there. It basically gives you access to the guideline. The guideline's been on the website for a while now. It talks about what we've been up to, and it gives you the ability to submit data to us. So for example, if you're currently in the province of Alberta, you're going to submit that through the province of Alberta, and hence we have a link to their site right here. But if you're in other provinces and you want to submit stuff to us, we want to basically start collecting this kind of data and being able to use it to basically drive sort of interventions and programs and stuff to prevent fatalities and serious injuries from occurring. And so, you can think of it kind of similar to the safety alerts. Here you have a safety alert, you want to share that. Here we're actually saying, hey, tell us more about an incident, a PSI that occurred in your organization, and share that. But we also do want, because we are getting the data from the Alberta government for oil and gas PSI submittals, we don't want to have any duplication there. So if you're in another jurisdiction, then we're asking you to share through here. I mean, you still have your regulatory requirements that apply in any jurisdiction you work in, but we want to build a basically database of this particular piece so that we can actually do a better job of preventing fatalities and serious injuries in the industry. And so this just gives you a view of some of the fields that you basically get access to, where it's basically asking you, what province you're in, the date of the incident, some details around industry code, so on and so forth. And then also, your name and email and things like that. And then we also have some pieces in here connecting to life-saving rules. So you can connect on that as well if it was a non-compliance with a life-saving rule. And then there's some pieces in here on corrective actions with some drop-down menus for folks to use. And so I think that's basically it. I'm thinking at the time we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So I'll pass it back over to you, Lucy, and yeah, we can go with some questions. We'll see how we can manage the volume issue.
Okay, how is my volume now?
It sounds good to me, but I've been hearing you be good the whole time. So what other people say?
We get some feedback.
Someone type in the chat session there if you can hear her.
Okay, super. So my apologies for the audio issues. The beginning of my presentation at the beginning was just to give an overview of how Zoom works. Thankfully, this far into the COVID issue and webinars, everyone's probably pretty experienced with Zoom now. So the other thing I had said was a little bio on Robert Waterhouse. He is a certified industrial hygienist with our office out of Calgary. So we're very happy to have him on staff and presenting on different topics. well into the fall. So again, if you hover around the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat option, and we welcome you to submit any questions.
Yeah, so I got one question there. The person's asking about, is the data from Alberta readily available? So we just got it yesterday through a secure transfer. And so we'll be spending some time basically in the next couple of weeks here, basically going through that, QC processes and whatnot. And we're going to generate a report that will be available to industry. And then that'll obviously be, aggregated information, right? So it's not identifying anyone or anything. And we'll have that available. And I suspect probably what we should do is actually do a webinar on that specific data on that report. So look for that basically sometime in September. I hope that answers your question. We were originally planning to have it for today, but it unfortunately just didn't work out that way.
I don't see any other questions, but I will watch the screen. So we'll move on to the next slide, which is a little heads up on upcoming webinars. August 20th is a session that will look at situational awareness of your workers and how you can use that kind of information in developing your competency programs. So that is that one. September 9th, we have a workshop on electronic logging devices, and our speakers come from Alberta Transportation and a couple of industry members from CalFrac and Chevron. On September 15th, the topic is key performance indicators in human and organizational performance, with two speakers that each have over 30 years of experience in different roles in the oil and gas industry.
Thanks there, Lucy. Yeah, the third one there is a part 3 of a 3-part series on sort of human performance and organizational performance. And then the second one there on the ELDs is going to be a bit of a panel where we'll have some discussions around ELDs, the legislation, what they are, ties in with fatigue management, hours of service, so fit for duty connection there, and also the impacts that will have to industry and how industry needs to, be thinking about these things going forward for when that legislation comes into effect, maybe next year, depending on whatever happens here. But the other thing I'll just part with, thanks there, Lucy, is just in relation to the government's feedback. Basically, I encourage you to go and let them know what you think, specifically on this topic. In their OHS, they have a survey link where you can go on their site and basically answer all these different questions that they have on a variety of different things in the Act, as well. That includes a section on PSI. And so think about that, think about the opportunities, think about how that Act and changes to that can help the PSI program here. And ultimately at the end of the day, our goal is basically so that no one is seriously injured or dies in our industry. That should be front and center for all of us. And so the question is how best to do that.
Okay. We have a couple questions. I'll address the one. Is it possible to get a certificate on completing this webinar? Unfortunately, no, that's not the intent, that these are information sessions. The other one, Robert, is PSI reporting the responsibility of the contract company or the prime if working on the prime site?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting point. So the way the legislation is written, it focuses on prime contractor. Interestingly enough, based on some of the preliminary data I'd seen from the government, you certainly saw the vast majority of reporting coming in from employers for oil and gas and not from the prime. So that's sort of, you can read what you want into that, but I think that's some of the feedback that the government's actually asking for right now. So I have my personal views on what I think, but I think at the end of the day, think about that and think about the employer versus prime and what makes sense there, and let the government know what your thinking is.
All right. And we'd love to let you know how we're doing with these webinars. We've emailed you a short survey to let us know what you think and to help guide us for future webinars with any topics that you are interested in learning more about. On behalf of Energy Safety Canada, I'd like to thank you, and thank you, Robert, for presenting today, and thank all of our attendees for taking the time to tune in to this webinar.
No, thank you very much. And folks, go have a look at the PSI program on our website. If you haven't done so already, spend some time looking at that guideline. It might assist you in your feedback to the government on this topic as well.
Okay.
Cool, thanks.
We will end the session.
I'm just going to stop recording.